Thank you. So the title of my presentation is CookUp Rice and the Performance of Guyanese Identities. And so two of the questions we're going to be answering today from this talk is, how is food both a substance and a symbol of identity? And when we talk about identity, we're talking about class, gender, race, religion, etc. And how does migration and globalization affect cuisines and the people who eat them? And in this talk today, I'm going to be asking you guys questions too, so feel free to talk back to me. So we're going to be quite interactive. When we think about food, often we don't think about the power of food. We don't think about the fact that food basically shaped the world as it is today. So think about it for a second. When we think about rice, cocoa, sugar, populations from Europe, from Africa, from all over the world moved to new places in order to produce food, right? So some people moved, or some people were moved, the enslaved people, to work on plantations. Some were moved to be of the imperial or planter class, and some then moved to take over that job when slavery ended. So when we think about it, there are people in the Caribbean, there are people in Central America, in the United States, all over the world because of food. So very often, though, we don't think about that power of food. And so that's one thing we'll keep in mind, right? So food is very central to who we are and what we do. When we think about something like sugar, especially where Guyana is concerned, Guyana is still a very big sugar-producing state, right? And when we think of sugar, it's very interesting that there was a point in time when only the rich people could afford sugar. So food is always a marker of class, and we'll talk some more about that, right? Could you imagine that today all of the cheap foods are loaded with sugar and we complain, but there was a time when you had to be rich to get one sugar cube, right? Very interesting. So as anthropologists, we often say that human beings use food instrumentally. And what we mean by that is that human beings, our culture takes our natural biological urges and shapes how we express them, right? So if we think about food, eating is a natural biological urge. We need to eat to live. We need to eat because we get hungry. And if we don't eat, we don't live. However, what we eat, how we eat, where we eat, and with whom we eat is shaped by the cultures in which we're growing up, right? So let's take a look at this photo, for example. Let's think about it. Everyone here is eating, right? So when you gather to eat, do you eat with your hands? Do you use a knife and fork? Do you sit on the floor? And if you use a knife and fork, what kinds of foods are you eating, right? These are just rhetorical questions sort of that I'm asking, because when we think about it, we all eat, but we eat differently. And even the types of food that we're eating often stipulate how we eat, right? So you may eat with a knife and fork on a regular basis, but I hope you don't eat pizza with a knife and fork. And if you do, I hope you don't do that in New York City, because they'll try to kill you for that, right? So when we talk about food in that way, when we talk about that we use humans use culture instrumentally, that's what we mean, right? So according to Sidney Mintz, what we like, what we eat, and how we feel about it are phenomenologically interrelated matters. Together, they speak eloquently to the question of how we perceive ourselves in relation to others, right? So food is so central to our sense of identity that the way any given group, human group eats helps to assert its diversity and hierarchy, and at the same time, both its oneness and otherness of whoever eats differently. So if we're to think about ourselves, we often say, well, we're not those people because we don't eat what? What are some of the things that those people might eat that we don't eat? Right? Because we're different. So food does not only help to bind us together with the people who are like us, food helps to distinguish us, right, from people who are not like us. And so we often say in anthropology that food has a voice. Food can speak. And when it speaks, what does it say? It tells us something about race. It tells us about race or ethnicity. We prefer to use the term ethnicity because it doesn't limit us to phenotype, how we look. Ethnicity is more encompassing in that it includes cultural practices, religion, and all of that, right? So the food voice can tell us something about religion, about gender, about class, about nationhood, and much more. So when we think about this country, Guyana, that I'll be talking about today, we'll see that food is just as important in this place as it is everywhere else. And since we're talking about CookUp Rice, we'll start out talking a bit about Guyana so you get an idea of where it is. Because I've been told before that it's not a real country, it doesn't exist, I made it up. Believe me, it does exist. I was born there, right? So let's talk a bit about Guyana. And then we'll talk about identity and specifically in relation to food. So the Guyanese people don't all look like me, right? The first Guyanese are Amerindians. They will be akin to Native Americans. Then we also have Chinese. We have East Indians. My pointer doesn't work. But East Indians from India or South Asia. And they are actually the largest ethnic group in Guyana. We have people of African descent. School children is not a race, but they were cute, so I added them to this, right? And so there's a group or an ethnic group of Guyanese that we generally kind of give them their own racial category. And we call these people Dudley, right? So when you look at them, you can see there that they're mixed race people. And the term Dudley was initially used to refer to people who are Indian and black mixed, biracial people of Indian and African ancestry, right? So I picked some random people off the internet, some random Dudley people, and why they're important to this discussion is not just because we're talking about Guyana and race, but you'll see how this term Dudley also connects to CookUp Rice. You guys may know the person on your far right. That is Tatiana Ali. She used to come in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I don't know, maybe I'm just old, but you guys may know her. And I picked her because she's a more public example of what Dudley is. So the term Dudley, we use the term Dudley in Guyana. In Trinidad and Tobago, they say Dougla, right? And it's the same thing. And it comes from the Hindi word dugala, meaning two necks. And it was not, initially when the term was coined, it was not necessarily a positive thing. It's like being called two-faced or fork-tongued. That's someone who's duplicitous. You can't trust them, right? And so it's like saying, you don't belong to the black people or the Indian people. You belong nowhere because you belong everywhere, right? So when we think of the Dudley people, we see CookUp Rice is like Dudley food, and we'll talk some more about that, right? So when we think about how food functions in Guyana, let's talk a bit about Guyana's foodscape. If you were to walk down the streets of Guyana, you'll see, for example, open markets. I don't know how many of you have had experiences with that. If you've traveled abroad, think of it as like the farmer's market, right? So a lot of where we buy our foods would look like that. You will see open markets, you'll see vendors in their trucks, you'll see food stands, maybe someone with a plastic tub selling food, trucks with vegetables. Food is everywhere. Sybil's restaurant is a Guyanese restaurant, but this one is in New York. But you'll see also restaurants selling Guyanese foods, right? So very colorful, very tasty. And so on the surface, people talk about Guyanese food as this umbrella term. But what is Guyanese food? Remember I showed you all of the different ethnic groups a few minutes ago? Well, under the umbrella of Guyanese food are the foods of each ethnic group. And so when you look beneath the surface, you can see the influences or the contributions of every ethnic group, right? So what we have here, we have on the top, this is an Amerindian woman or an indigenous Guyanese, a first Guyanese. She's making something called cassava bread. Are you guys familiar with cassava? Do you know what it is? It is a tuber. You might have heard the term yucca. I don't know if we have internet, but if at the end I'll show it to you. We do have internet? Okay, so I will show it to you at the end, remind me. Right, so she's making cassava bread. And so the cassava is grated and the juices are extracted and they make it into this bread that's then eaten with pepper pot. Pepper pot is made with this brown sauce and it has lots of peppers, it's very spicy. This is actually our national dish. Right, so but this is the contribution. If you ask Guyanese, so what's your national dish? They'll say pepper pot without thinking. That little boy is just making pepper pot because I made him. That's my child. So, I keep them involved and teaching them the culture. So what we have here, the contribution of the Chinese, right? We still make fried rice and chow meins and stuff like that. And if you speak to the average Guyanese person who travels home and they're coming back, they have some kind of frozen fried rice hidden in between their clothes. Don't tell customs because this is what they do. It's like they want the food from home, right? It's about, and we'll talk some more about that. Then we have the East Indian influence, roti and curry. The average girl in Guyana had to learn how to make roti. Most of us, our roti was horrible the first few times we made it. But this is the East Indian influence. And you see under the umbrella of Guyanese foods, all of these different influences. And even though we don't have a significant European population, what they have brought, the things they have introduced, are still there. South and black pudding and white pudding, which are like, have you guys ever had blood sausages? It is so good, but it is so, yes. It's delicious, but not it's an acquired taste, right? And then we have African fufu, right? And so fufu, again, is made with tubers, the same kind of cassava or yams or plantains, and they're boiled and then pounded into this rubbery texture. So if you've ever played with Play-Doh, think of something that's a little more rubbery than Play-Doh, but it looks like mashed potato or tastes a bit like mashed potato, but with a different constituency, right? And then I have CookUp Rice, which is what we're talking about today. And the reason I put a question mark is because if you ask Guyanese people, everyone will claim CookUp Rice. They will say, well, it's just Guyanese food, or it's just poor people's food. And the black people will say, well, it's African food. And everyone can lay claim to it because of how it's made, because of how it emerged, right? And so when we talk about food, Mary Weissmantel states that it is because they are ordinarily immersed in everyday practice in a material way that foods, abstracted as symbols from this material process, can condense in themselves a wealth of ideological meanings. So because they are paired all the time, this is Indian food. We cook this at Indian weddings. When we have Indian deaths or funeral services, we serve this. Over time, this food is inherently linked, that when you eat it, you are reminded that you're eating, right? This type of food. Food and race is inherently linked. But here's a big kicker. Food is also a very powerful marker of gender. I don't think we place as much emphasis. I don't know about your homes, but when we were growing up, it was a big part of what we call the process of enculturation, the process by which a child learns his or her culture. And so you learn your culture sometimes by direct instruction. Your parents teach you sit this way, stand this way, pray this way, direct instruction. But you also learn to be members of your culture, sometimes by just watching. So have you ever heard, for example, someone says, oh my God, she's everything like her mom, or he walks just like his dad. You weren't really looking at him and just mimicking him, but subconsciously you learned how to be. And so food this is the way we learned how to cook, how to eat, how to behave with food in the Guyanese community. It's a very big part of the process of enculturation, but it also validates womanhood or manhood. Right? So men are supposed to eat a certain way. Men are supposed to eat big foods, heavy foods like the tubers we talked about, plantains and big dumplings that we call duff. Women are supposed to be good cooks, right? So before you even decide that you're going to get married, your parents are like, they're behind you. you have to learn to cook. How are you going to get married? Or if you're getting married and they don't think you're very good, they're going to warn you, your husband will beat you. And you guys are all progressive. Her eyes popped open like, what? Yes, that is really a thing. Yes, this is a thing. They will warn you because in their head, this is normal, right? And so you have to learn to cook. And they would say, back to the CookUp Rice again, you have to be able to cook at least a pot of CookUp. This one boil up thing, you must be able to do something, right? Because as a woman, that's one of the ways you validate your usefulness, your skill, your value, right? And so women are often the ones that kind of, they're the ones that take care of the kitchen in a way. And even though men cook, they're not expected to cook, right? So it's like, it's a bonus if you're a man and you can cook. But it's a real tragedy if you're a woman and you can't cook. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? All right, good. So I'm not alone. All right? So food then is a source of power. So even for women who are often disparaged for not being able to cook or cook well, a lot of times, because they're the ones controlling the kitchen, they get to determine who is eating what. And then you can do good things or bad things with food. So I just said that food is linked to gender. If we're to think about our society, American society, in what ways might food and gender be related? Let me ask a more specific question. Are there things or foods that you believe that men are supposed to eat this, and this is what women are supposed to eat? Do you have any? What are some of the things that men should eat? What are men or man food?
I feel like it's like a lot of times more acceptable for guys to eat unhealthily.
Yes.
Health conscious.
Yes. Good. Mm-hmm.
Kind of just going off that, like my answer was like girls, like generally I feel like eat more like salads and things like that, and like guys will eat like a lot of like protein, like steak, like
Cheeseburgers.
chicken or like steak,
Yeah.
cheeseburgers, and like big like portions of those things.
Yeah. And so even though we tend to think sometimes and we say to ourselves, oh no, we're progressive. We don't think like that, that's old fashioned. If you see a man sit down with a tiny salad, you're going to start whispering like, what's wrong with him? Or if you see a woman with a big rack of lamb, like, what is wrong with her? Because these things we're so wired, right? It's a part of our enculturation. So it's like that in Guyana. And you guys mentioned the salad. A lot of times we associate dainty foods, small portion sizes with women, which is not really true because some of us could eat. And like hearty foods, like this is what we will call metemg. This is what real men should eat. There's coconut milk in that if you can't, if you can really see it. Coconut milk and corn and dumplings and cassava. And then their foods, the reason that certain foods are also linked to gender is because they're linked to sexuality or to virility. So you have here foods like manish water, which we would make. The Jamaicans would make it too. And so you would find things like the goat's head. Sometimes you would find genitals. Why are people consuming genitals, animals, scrotums and things like that? You guys could talk about your faces. Am I grossing you guys out? Well, because it's linked to virility. If I consume this, then I will be like the ox, the bull, whatever that thing is that I consume, right? You guys have heard of oysters. Men eat it because it's supposed to make them whatever. And of course, steak and proteins often associated with men. So it's like that. But when we talk about foods, we also have to think that food also demarcates or highlights class, right? If we think, for example, during slavery, or if we think about people who were poor in general, have you guys eaten any of these? Innards, offal.
Liver?
You've eaten liver, kidneys, chicken feet. Come on. No, that's gizzard, right? So there was a point in time where the wealthy people wouldn't eat this, right? Now you can go into Walmart and you can buy cow tongue. You know that, right? And so, but there was a point in time where those things were discarded. And so the poorer people would eat them, they would cook them and make all of these foods that we now like to call soul foods and good home cooking and stuff like that. But those are that's one of the ways that class was highlighted through food and still is today. And so this idea of making something from nothing, they would take these discarded pieces of food, many of them very high in fats and things like that, and they would create all kinds of dishes, right? Chitlins and black-eyed peas and chicken feet, and down south we do that too, right? So another way that food highlights class is through the use of one-pot meals, right? And this is, we're getting closer to the CookUp Rice, right? One-pot meals. In the South, there's something called Hoppin' John. It's the same kind of thing like the CookUp Rice we'll talk about, but Hoppin' John does not have coconut milk in it. So maybe today what we have is Hoppin' John, right? But we also see one-pot meals like gumbo, right? What do one-pot meals do? They conserve on time and utensils, right? If you are working the fields, if you have 3, 4, 5 jobs, if you have limited amount, you don't have enough of this thing to cook a meal, you don't have enough of that thing, it's a way of combining them. Combining them, using less utensils and cooking something that's delicious, that's tasty, right? It also prevents waste. So a lot of times, the one-pot meals that we talk about are meals that you have leftovers, you have, like I said before, things that you would have otherwise thrown away, and you create a new dish, a new cuisine from it, right? You can also feed many people. So when we look at CookUp Rice, you'll see what I mean by that. If you have a lot of people coming, you don't have to create little tiny meals like appetizers. There's a big pot, and you have protein, you have vegetables, you have starches, everything in that one pot, right? You save money, and more importantly, you make do. You adapt, right? You make do with what you have. And so this brings us to CookUp Rice, because CookUp Rice is one of those one-pot meals we talk about. The ingredients of CookUp Rice are rice, peas or beans, coconut milk or cream, meats and vegetables, right? So as you start cooking it, what most people would do is that they would boil the peas until it's half or parboiled, half cooked. They would wash the rice, add it. They would add, so a lot of times they cook the meats separately and then they combine them to make sure that no ingredient is overcooked or undercooked, right? So everything has a certain timing as to when you add it to the pot, right? So we often refer to CookUp Rice as a Douglas pot. Do you remember what Douglas is? What's a Douglas? A Douglas person.
Like a mixed person or like a two-faced person.
Don't call him two-faced. Yeah, it comes from the word Dugala, but a mixed person, right? Somebody who's biracial or multiracial, right? We call them Douglas, and that's a category, a racial category in Guyana, Douglas in Trinidad. So we often refer to Douglas. Some people would just say, for example, I'm making a Douglas pot. You know that they're making CookUp Rice, right? They're going to make this pot that's very colorful and very nutritious in many ways. Some of you might run away because you can see the chicken feet over there, right? You should try it. And so, so the CookUp Rice is often named for the peas or beans that are in it. So if it's made with black-eyed peas, they would say, well, I'm making black-eyed CookUp, or I'm making split peas CookUp, or chana CookUp. Chana is chickpeas or garbanzo beans, right? So, okay. Very often, you would hear the African Guyanese would say, well, CookUp is our thing. And here are some of the reasons. Rice. Guyana has been cultivating rice since the 1800s. But often when people think of rice, they think of Asia. And there's a strain of rice that was developed in Asia, the Oryza sativa rice. But in Africa, there's a different strain of rice, the Oryza glaberrima rice, or the red rice that was developed there. And that many of the enslaved peoples that were taken to Guyana and the South, like South Carolina, who became what are known now as the Gullah people, those people were taken from areas that were already cultivating rice. So when they were taken to these other parts of the world, they already knew how to cultivate rice. The Asia rice, or the Osativa rice, as it's commonly called, was a higher yielding rice. So that became more popular, and that replaced the Glaberrima rice. But in Trinidad and certain places, people continue to farm this rice just as a way of holding on to culture, and it's very different, right? Another reason that African Guyanese will say, oh, this is our foods, is because some of the CookUp is theirs, is because some of the ingredients, the main ingredients that you would find, people would add, are also foods that originated on the continent of Africa, like black-eyed peas, right? And partly because it was cheap. Okra, collards, right? And so when we look at black-eyed peas, we see that in communities, black communities around the world, they continue to use black-eyed peas, right? As it's a very central part of their lives. So we have the CookUp rice, but in the South we have the hoppin' john. The Nigerians would make a meal called moi moi. So different folks are still using the black-eyed peas. What do you guys use black-eyed peas for? Or do you eat it at all?
They're mostly northerners. I was saying earlier that in Texas, every New Year's Day, we have black-eyed peas for good luck.
Yes. We will talk some more about that, the function of this CookUp rice. Another, the okra is another thing that was that's considered to be African, and even the word gumbo, a word that you guys have heard that word before, right? In the South, they make gumbo, right? The word gumbo is okra. That's the word for okra. Right? So, so these are some of the reasons, but then everyone, just any ethnic group in Guyana can claim that the CookUp rice is theirs, because again, you can find elements of other ethnic groups' heritage in that CookUp rice, such as chana. Chana CookUp, my favorite, after black eye CookUp, but I like them the same, right? So the chana CookUp, I like chickpeas, and so basically, people can use any peas to make CookUp rice, and that's one of the reasons. But as I said before, just as I said earlier, food is often a marker of class. Remember I talked about that? Where poor people were often the ones eating the extremities, the innards, and things like that, because those were discarded or relatively cheap. With meals or with cuisines like CookUp, you also have often have it prepared on coal pots, or this is a cooking device, right? So a type of charcoal will be placed on the bottom. They would light it. The pot will go on the top. Sometimes they will cook outside in the open. You know, some people would say, for example, that barbecuing things make it taste sweeter or more delicious, right? That's what people believe. When you cook certain foods in the open air, using wood, using charcoal, not the same kind of charcoal we use in the barbecue grill, that it tastes more delicious. But more importantly, poorer people would use this because it was a cheaper form of fuel, right? And so very often you find that with CookUp rice, most people, even if they have gas stoves, they decide that we want it to taste a certain way. We want that smoke in it, right? And so they would cook it on the outside. CookUp is very important, not just because of all of the things I said about one-pot meals, cutting down on time and utensils and cooking for a lot of people, but it's considered quick food, right? It's a quick food. You can, I don't have to spend time. Everything is in the pot. I just cover it, and now I can simmer, right? You put it in a crock pot even, and you just leave it. On Sundays, a lot of people would, this is their Sunday meal. If they're not making a big pot of soup with all kinds of meats and tubers and stuff like that, they're making CookUp. But it's definitely an Old Year's night meal. And so when we talk about Old Year's night, we're talking about New Year's Eve. That's what we call it, right? Old Year's night, New Year's Eve. And so for many people, it's not just that they cook CookUp, but it has to be black-eyed peas CookUp. In the South, they do the same thing. In Texas, I found out today they do it too. But Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, because black-eyed peas is considered like money or good luck, right? And these traditions have held over for so long. And so why are they cooking Cocup on Old Year's night? Many people believe that how you start the new year is how the entire year would go. So they would clean their homes and they would cook these foods. But this food that represents money and wealth, they would cook it, right? And so some people would cook 2 or 3 different types of CookUp rice. They may cook black-eye CookUp and chana and different things, but they must have it. Are they going to eat all of that food? Maybe not. But it's this idea of having food and having your home clean and being ready for the new year. They also cook black-eye CookUp. They also they cook it and they serve it at wakes. Do you guys, you know what a wake is, right? When somebody passes, you sit up and you keep you gather, you comfort those that are bereaved. But in the past, it used to be a time when you actually stay awake to ensure that that person is really dead. The family, the relatives stay awake to make sure they're not just in a coma and we're going to just bury them or something like that. But you keep a vigil, so to speak. CookUp Rice, and all the community members are coming in. That's a time when you're able to serve everybody food because you have everything in that one pot. Christmas time, that's another time that people cook up. During the Kwekwe ritual, Kwekwe is an African Guyanese pre-wedding ritual, and it takes place the night before a wedding, where the families of the bride and groom, called their nations, would get together to sing and to dance and to provide instruction to the bride and groom on matters of marriage, everything from how you should cook and how you should clean and sex and everything and children, everything. And during that night, of course, it's a community affair. Everyone comes and CookUp rice is served. Good Friday, right? So I said CookUp is served on holidays and holy days. What happens on Good Friday? What kinds of things do you eat or can't you eat on Good Fridays? Do you guys have any stipulations? Yes. You're not supposed to eat meat. So some people would just, it's here, good. Yeah, so some people would turn to fish or they would cook ital CookUp. Now, ital is a word that the Rastafarians would use, right, to refer to the fact that their food does not have meat and does not have salt specifically, right? So sometimes people would do that. So they still want to eat this CookUp, but they're accommodating religious stipulations. They're accommodating, holidays and holy days. In some instances, too, you have excuse me, other religious groups that may modify their CookUp rice to suit their religious beliefs. So Seventh-day Adventists, for example, would not put pork in their CookUp rice, whereas other people would put pork. You have Hindus may not put beef in their CookUp rice, right, and stuff like that. So you have, based on those religious beliefs, people will also modify their CookUp rice, right? So what happens to food when people migrate from one place to the next? All of our parents, grandparents came from someplace else. Italy, Ireland, the continent of Africa, someplace. What do you think happened when they moved to the United States? What happened to the foods that they were preparing before? What did they do about it?
They try to replicate it, right?
In some ways, they try to replicate it. This is what we used to make in the old village. What else do you think happens to that food? That's another thing. You try to replicate it, but sometimes you just don't have that thing. There's that spice. There's that coconut milk. Right? You don't have that thing. So you use whatever you have. You make do. Right? What else happens to the food? In some instances, because we've now met up with other peoples, right? We're going to take, I like this spice. I like to put cumin in everything, and the people around me hate it, right? I grew up eating cumin because of the Indian influence, and I have curries in my house all the time. But then you start adding other, right? So think about it this way. Most of us eat pizza, I'm assuming, right? We eat pizza. Where did that come from? Where did that originate? That idea of the pizza? That's not a trick question. Yeah. So what do you think Italians think when they eat our pizza? Gross, exactly. But this is what it is. We're like, oh, my ancestors are Italian. We eat pizza, we eat pasta. And they're like, that's not pizza. Because it has changed over time. Even we change over time, right? And that affects our foods. So when I was growing up, the chicken feet I keep showing you and teasing you about, I loved it. Do you know, I'm so grossed out. I'm older now, and I'm like, how were we eating this thing? But so there are just some things, as you get older, you change, your tastes change. Sometimes you develop allergies. We were talking about that today, and like, I like it, but I can't eat it. I get sick. And so we change. And so food, according to Mary Douglas, foods help us to recall other foods. When we migrate to other parts of the world, and so when Guyanese migrate to New York City, for example, every time they sit to eat CookUp Rice, it reminds them of the last time they ate CookUp Rice. It reminds them of the people they ate with. It reminds them of certain smells, the atmosphere. I want you to think about that for a minute. And so think about the foods, and when you eat it, for example, what is that food that you eat? It's like, oh my God, my grandma makes the best, whatever it is. And some people eat and they cry or they moan or they groan because their minds go someplace else. Do you have any foods like that? You guys just eat. They're like, oh, we don't care. Yes, I believe you do. Do you have any foods like that?
Chicken and dumplings.
Chicken and dumplings. What's the relevance of chicken and dumplings?
My grandma.
Grandma.
Yeah, grandma.
Yeah?
Like crabs, like small like Old Bay,
Uh-huh.
like summertime.
Yes, okay. For many African Guyanese and other Guyanese who have migrated from home, what food does is that it connects them where they are with the past, right? It connects the past and the present. When they're eating, they're not in Brooklyn someplace, they're not in Canada someplace, they're in the village, they're sitting under that tree with their friends, they're sharing whatever they did that time, right? That is what food does. It binds time, it connects the past and the present. But sometimes it connects the past and the present in more, I guess, intangible ways. And so you would have some people, for example, leaving out foods for their ancestors. Like, we call that libation, food for the dead, right? And so it's not just binding them to other living people, it's connecting them to an even more distant past. And so when people migrate, they may not be able to get the ingredients, for example, that they need. So we're laughing at the no coconut milk, but sometimes maybe you start the pot and you realize, I don't have coconut milk, so I'm going to use evaporated milk or some other milk. And it's not going to taste the same, but this will do. Sometimes you realize that you don't have other ingredients, and so people will have things shipped from home. I live in South Carolina, and a lot of what I need I can get, but I often find myself going to New York City to buy things or calling my friends in Georgia where there's a greater Caribbean population and having them ship things to me because I'm desperate. I'm very desperate for some things, right? So and people do this all the time. They travel all over the world and they bring back certain things because they want to keep that community going. But what happens when you're eating a certain way, when you're forming a community, right? You're knitting yourself to the people who are like you. You are also inadvertently or deliberately distinguishing yourselves from others. Does that make sense? So we're creating this group. This is us. This is what we eat. And this is them, right? They don't eat that thing. And so for Guyanese people, it's especially interesting because other Caribbean people have CookUp rice. The Trinidadians call it pilau, for example. And if you hear Caribbean people talking about CookUp rice, they act like they invented it. Every country talks about it, and every country talks about how theirs is the best. Ours is really the best. You should believe that. But this is what happens, right? Because it's a way of demarcating their space, of policing their ethnic boundaries. And so one of the things as they eat, one of the things food does is help them to reconstruct home, as I said before, to create this sense of where we belong. We might never go back there to live, We might never see that land again, but every time we eat this food, we kind of symbolically travel back. Does that make sense? And what eating the same things does, and eating the same things does, and specifically CookUp Rice, is that it creates an imagined community. And so this term, imagined community, was coined by Benedict Anderson. And he, in the use of this term, this phrase, imagined community, he was talking about people who were reading the same papers from home every day at the same time. And so an imagined community is created when you do the same things. Even though I may never see you, I may never see that other Guyanese person, by or through the act of eating, specifically this CookUp Rice that is so central to who we are, we create a community of, let's say, eaters, right? A community of Guyanese people. That is an imagined community. And so that's one of the things that food does. And so David Sutton, who does a lot of work on food and memory, he states that there's an imagined community implied in the act of eating food from home while in exile, in the embodied knowledge that others are eating the same foods, right? And so when you eat, when you think of food, I want you to think of that thing. I know I asked you that before, and you guys didn't give me a very good answer. You kind of avoided me, so we'll go back there again. What is that thing that you eat that reminds you of home, reminds you of people, reminds you of relationships, experiences, that is so important that maybe every year at the same time, I have to eat this thing. Maybe at least once a year, or maybe when my friend comes to town or something like that, we have to eat that thing. What is that thing? Yes?
Could be like stuffing on Thanksgiving.
Stuffing on Thanksgiving, right. So I don't need stuffing at any other time of the year, but Thanksgiving, how are you going to have this turkey without stuffing? Yes. What else?
Just like my family.
Say that again?
Sauce?
Like Vietnamese food.
Vietnamese, okay. Okay, Vietnamese food, yes. When do you guys eat? I mean, like, how often do you guys get together to eat?
I mean, it's usually like when I go over to my grandparents' house and like
Yeah. That's very important, because here's the thing. For many of us, it's not just eating it, because there are many, like I said before, Guyanese restaurants all over, and I can go and buy just about anything I can cook in my house. But there's something different about sitting together, right? This group is peeling potatoes, this group is grating, this group is, I hated to grate coconuts, I still do. It doesn't matter who cries, shame at me, I will use canned coconut milk. I don't like to grate, but the point is, when your hand is in it, when your energy is in it, when your time is in it, all of that relationship matters. And so when my grandmother would come, I remember every time we spent with her, because we were doing things that maybe my mom did it, but kids are kind of terrible like that. Yeah, it's my mom, but grandma is doing it. We're making jams, we're doing special things. And so those things take on a special meaning, because my grandmother was not there all the time. She came once, twice, 3 times a year. Does that make sense? So she might have been doing the same things that my mom did, but she did it better, and she only did it 3 times a year. So it took on greater significance. What else do you have? Okay, even if you guys can't think of anything now, the next time you sit to eat, I want you to think about what you're eating, right? Not just what the name of it is, but what's in it. Where did those foods come from? Who made it? And I'm sure that sometimes you make your own foods, right? Yes? College students, besides the ramen noodles, you guys, I'm hoping you do cook. But anyway, the point I wanted to make, by using CookUp Rice, I wanted to show how food has power. Food has power to tell the world who we are. Food has power to help us create community, to identify or to highlight gendered values in a society, class, race, religion, and so much more. Because we could have gone into talking about, for example, the Jewish faith, where you can't eat certain things, right? Because it's against the laws, the kosher laws and things like that. And it's not just for food, but other behaviors. But yes, religion, race, class, everything. And so when we look at CookUp Rice, we see that that has significance for the Guyanese people. And that's just one meal. So thank you very much.